Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Life of the Emperor Francis Joseph by Francis Gribble. Chapter 13.
Between 1859 and 1866, Francis Joseph had a 7 years respite in which to solve his problems, but 1866 found them still unsolved. At home, he had advanced a little way towards liberalism, and then withdrawn. Abroad, he had let himself become entangled in the net spread by Bismarck. Nor can the two mistakes be separated, for it was largely because he had failed to conciliate his subjects that he could not face his enemies. The fact that the Hungarians were still sullen made it comparatively easy for Prussia to turn Austria out of the German Confederation. Space forbids one to say more of the difficulty between Austria and Prussia than that it was the difficulty which arises when two men have to ride the same horse, and both of them want to ride in front. It was brought to a head by dissensions over the settlement of that complicated Schleswig-Holstein question, concerning which a British statesman once remarked that only two men had ever understood it, and that one of the two was dead and the other in a lunatic asylum. An agreement on the question, concluded at a personal interview between Francis Joseph and the King of Prussia, was described by Bismarck as no better than a piece of sticking plaster. And no doubt Bismarck made it his business to see that the sticking plaster did not stick. He first secured French neutrality at a famous interview at Biarritz, and then he proceeded to negotiate with Italy. Here again we see an instructive example of Habsburg pride preceding a Habsburg fall. Italy had recently proposed to buy Venetia from Austria. Francis Joseph, knowing that the Venetians loathed him to a man, had nevertheless replied, in a scornful communication, that Austria's military honor and dignity as a first-class power required him to retain them as his subjects. Quote, "She would be unaffected by an offer of money or by any kind of moral pressure. She could only abandon the territory of her own free will in the event, not specially desired by her, of a war which terminated gloriously for Austrian arms and facilitated the extension of the Austrian Empire in the direction of Germany." Unquote. In one and the same dispatch, that is to say, Austria insulted Italy and invited Italy to help her in despoiling Prussia. That was a rash temptation of Providence, and the result of it was that an Italian envoy went to Berlin to negotiate a treaty. Then Austria was frightened and offered to eat her words and cede Venetia if only Italy would leave her free to deal separately with Prussia. It was a tardy and clumsy piece of suppleness, and it did not answer. Victor Emmanuel liked fighting, had promised to fight, and fought. We all know what happened. How the defeat of the Italians at Custozza by the Archduke Albert was more than counterbalanced by the defeat of the Austrians at Sadowa, and how Austria had to accept her humiliation, submit to be turned out of the German Federation, and surrender Venetia to Italy, after a plebiscite had been taken to ascertain those wishes of the population, which Francis Joseph had so haughtily refused to recognize. The figures give eloquent evidence of the feelings of alien races towards Austrian rule. They were as follows. For annexation, 640,000, against 40, majority for 639,960. The result, one may be sure, would have been pretty much the same if a plebiscite had been taken in the Trentino and South Tyrol. There also, Austrian rule was unsympathetic, and that sore still remains open, with the result that, though Austria and Italy are now nominally allied, they are very far from being friends, and Italy still awaits her chance of responding to the lamentations which continue to reach her from the purgatory of the unredeemed. We shall see what we shall see in this connection when Austria is next embarrassed. But meanwhile, we must return to Francis Joseph's part in this great drama of 1866. His sphere of action was not the battlefield, but the council chamber, but there his prestige was felt, even in the hour of his discomfiture. Europe was still, to some extent, a family party in which the sentiment prevailed that kings and emperors must not be too hard on each other. And German Europe, at any rate, was still fascinated by the spectacle of the magnificent facade of the House of Habsburg and reluctant to damage it in the spirit of Goths and Vandals. Even Bismarck's realistic politics had to allow for that sentiment, and it was a sentiment of which Francis Joseph, on his part, instinctively perceived the value. His perception of it is the solid fact at the back of the strange story of his shameful behavior towards General Benedek. A story in which he figures as the Jesuit, convinced that the end justifies the means, and that individuals must be sacrificed ruthlessly to the interests of the order. One cannot expect much of a man who has been educated by the Jesuits, said the late Prince Consort, summing him up with curt scorn, and there will be no pleasant disappointment of expectations in the story which is to follow. The interest of the order, in this instance, meant the interest of the dynasty. Whatever happened to Austria, the House of Habsburg must not suffer. Francis Joseph did not enter upon the struggle in a spirit of blind confidence. The Prussians, he knew, were armed with the new needle gun, which might work surprising wonders. Defeat was possible, and if defeat occurred, a scapegoat would be wanted. Francis Joseph, as a young soldier, had been ready to take risks and had gallantly assured Radetzky that Austria had no lack of archdukes. But Francis Joseph, in his maturity, did not want it to be possible for anyone to say that an archduke had led the Austrian army to disaster, lest his subjects should lose their illusions about his house and the revolutionary spirit should revive. His best general was the Archduke Albert, and he dared not risk him in conflict with von Moltke. That archduke had played an odious part, not yet forgotten, in the street fighting at Vienna. His men might follow him with reluctance. His defeat would disgust Austria with the dynasty itself, and the interest of the dynasty was, in Francis Joseph's view, the thing. So the Archduke was given a comparatively easy task in Italy, and the really difficult work in Bohemia was forced upon General Benedek, who knew that he was unfit for it, and said so. He was too old, he pleaded. He did not know the country in which he would have to fight. As the Prussian General von Schlichting afterwards put it, quote, his experience was like that of a pilot who has all his life guided small boats over the shallows and by the rocks of his native bay with unsurpassable skill and knowledge of the locality, and has now for the first time to take a warship of the first class across strange seas and through cyclones of which he has no experience. Unquote. It was a perilous and almost a hopeless attempt, but Francis Joseph insisted upon his making it. He wanted to be sure, in case of disaster, of a scapegoat who could be sent out into the wilderness, leaving the honor and dignity of the Habsburgs intact. So he sent Benedek a message through Adjutant General Count Crenville, begging him to accept the command as a personal favor, saying that if he refused it and the war turned out badly, his own abdication would probably be forced upon him. In such circumstances, wrote Benedek, I should have acted very wrongly if I had refused the command, and no doubt the dictates of discipline did necessitate his acceptance of it. So Benedek marched to Sadowa. The battle which hit Austria as hard as Sedan was afterwards to hit France. His losses there were 7 flags, 160 guns, 4,861 killed, 13,920 wounded, and about 20,000 prisoners. He was broken like an old sword, and there was nothing for him to say except, how could we face the Prussians? They are men of study, and we have learned little. Unquote. Or rather, though there was a good deal more which he might have said, he was persuaded not to say it either before the military court which reviewed his conduct or elsewhere. As Adjutant General Count Crenville had been sent to him before, so the Archduke Albert was sent to him now at Gratz in Styria, whither he had retired after being deprived of his command. He was asked to give a written promise that he would not publish any of the correspondence which had passed between himself and his generals, or himself and the emperor, or publicly vindicate himself in any way. He gave that promise, and the proceedings begun against him were suspended. But then we come to Francis Joseph's perfidy. Francis Joseph wanted a scapegoat badly, and he paid Benedek the compliment of believing him to be a more honorable man than himself. He acted indirectly instead of directly, semi-officially instead of officially, hitting at the man who was down and had promised to make no attempt to rise by means of an article in the Wiener Zeitung. The article began by stating that there was no law in Austria which punished incompetence, and it continued, for the rest, the loss of the confidence of his imperial master, the destruction of his military reputation before the world of today and of the future, the recognition of the immeasurable misfortune that, under his command, has befallen the army, and through its defect has befallen the whole monarchy, must be a heavier penalty for the high-minded man that Benedek always was, than any punishment that could have come upon him by the continuation of legal proceedings." Unquote. One can imagine Benedek's anger at this black treachery, but he did not allow it to sting him into the retractation of his pledged word. He maintained to the end the attitude of an honorable man whom a dishonorable emperor had tricked, and he bore contumely in silence. It was only in his will that he spoke out, but then he gave full vent to the indignation which he had so long suppressed. This is his last word on the matter, quote, "That the Austrian government, having in its hand my promise of silence, given to the Archduke Albert on November 19, 1866, and believing in the honorableness of my promise, should publish this strange article, in which my whole past was ignored, and that this government article, which it is impossible to qualify, was conceived in the presidential chancellery of the General Staff, corrected and improved by Field Marshal Lieutenant Baron John, Field Marshal Archduke Albert, and others, and finally published by order of the government in all its peculiar features. All this surpasses my ideas of right, decency, and propriety. I suffered it in silence, and I have now for 7 years borne my hard lot as a soldier with philosophy and self-denial. I take credit to myself that, in spite of it all, I feel no anger against anybody and am not soured. I am at peace with myself and the whole world, and have a clear conscience. But it has cost me all my poetic feeling for soldiering. I should like to be borne to my grave with the utmost simplicity and without any military honors. A plain stone or an iron cross without any epitaph must be put over my grave." Unquote. Meanwhile, Benedek refused ever again to put on his uniform and lived as a lodger in a boarding house at Gratz. Francis Joseph did not like it. It was a reflection on him, especially after von Moltke had complimented Benedek as a commander of courage and merit. But all the overtures which Francis Joseph's pride permitted him to make were met in a spirit of sullen resentment. When the Archduke Albert was directed to write to Benedek as to an old campaigner and a brother in arms, he replied with cold respect. The Crown Prince Rudolph was then directed to write to him, but he neither asked for an audience, as he was expected to do, nor even answered the letter, merely permitting the Crown Prince's military tutor to fabricate and carry a message, thanking the Emperor for the graceful way in which he has remembered me. "I am an isolated man," he then said. "I need no external honor, and I feel that my internal honor is unstained. In this matter, I acknowledge no earthly judge." Not long afterwards, he died of cancer of the larynx, and even then the memory of the wrong lingered. This is what his widow wrote to her nephew in reference to the letters of condolence which she had received, quote, "Bismarck's letter, written throughout with his own hand, was the only one from a high personage which touched me. The telegrams from the Emperor and the Archduke left me very cold. When the Emperor sent the Crown Prince to us in 1873 as an apostle of conciliation, Benedek had suffered so much during the 7 years that he refused everything and begged that they would not disturb the repose he had at last attained. The Emperor, always generous, had at least the goodness to ask if there was nothing he could do for me. He is generous. I thanked him sincerely. I need nothing." Unquote. So the story ends, and it has been necessary to tell it at some length because of the luminous light which it throws on Francis Joseph's character. Some historians have spoken of it as an isolated stain upon an otherwise blameless personality. But it is, in fact, of a piece with the whole personality, though the occasions which have called for such disagreeable manifestations of the personality have happily been rare. Francis Joseph was always able to give his equals, and has gradually learnt to be able to give his inferiors the impression that he is genial affability incarnate. It is not natural to him to be mean or paltry. He very much prefers to be splendid. But there is, and has always been, at the bottom of his mind a certain confusion of thought. If he has not mistaken himself for God, at least he has mistaken the interests of the House of Habsburg for that higher law to which the ordinary laws of honor and morality which bind ordinary men must be subordinated. In the case under review, the interests of the House of Habsburg needed a scapegoat, and therefore Benedek had to go out into the wilderness. He did not go out of his own accord. He was not driven out. He was tricked out by false pretenses, and then pointed at with the finger of scorn. His widow's letter, which we have just read, reads like a quiet, measured echo of Countess Karoli's curse, to the various fulfillments of which we shall come in the course of a few chapters. If she had less reason than Countess Karoli to curse Francis Joseph, at least she had reason enough.
Chapter 14.
Defeated by the Prussians, Francis Joseph felt that he must come to terms with the Hungarians. Their sullen and enduring disaffection had been one of the causes of his discomfiture. They seemed to be looking on, rather pleased than otherwise, at the spectacle of the Habsburg Empire in the melting pot, and there were even Hungarian exiles helping the enemies of the Habsburgs. It was necessary to win them over, even at the cost of giving them what they wanted. The popularity of the Empress helped to make them approachable. It would be an exaggeration to say that the Hungarians loved the Emperor because they had first loved the Empress, and loved the Empress because of her friendship for Nicholas Esterhazy. But that, nevertheless, was the trend of Hungarian sentiment. Elizabeth was, at all events, a friend at court, and since she had been Empress, there had been far more Hungarians about the court than previously. So now, after Sadowa, but before his acceptance of the Prussian terms, Francis Joseph sent for the Hungarian leader, Francis Deák, a stubborn man, but moderate, and with a statesman's eye for the practical. Deák obeyed the summons and was ushered into a room in which he saw the emperor alone, absorbed in thought. After a short silence, a short dialogue passed between them. "Well, Deák, what does Hungary demand?" "No more than she demanded before Sadowa, but no less." "And what have I to do now?" "Your Majesty must first make peace and then give Hungary her rights." "If I give Hungary a constitution at once, will the Hungarian parliament vote me money to carry on this war?" "No, Your Majesty, the Hungarian parliament will do nothing of the kind." Unquote. For two reasons: because Hungary had no quarrel with Prussia, and because the hour of Francis Joseph's embarrassment was the hour in which it would be easiest to bargain with him. So Francis Joseph realized that Deák had him at an advantage. He remained silent for a few moments and then said simply, "Very well, I suppose it must be as you insist." That was the quiet origin of the present Austro-Hungarian constitution, the system known as dualism. It solved one Austrian problem with a stroke of the pen. But there were a good many other problems which it left unsolved. Notably, it left unsolved the pressing problem of the Slavs, whom the Hungarians, no less than the Austrians, regarded as inferior people, only fit to be oppressed. What the Hungarians had wanted and now obtained was not equal rights all round, but an invitation to go into partnership with the oppressors, and Magyarize one half of the empire, while the Austrians were Germanizing the other half. Whereupon there came a furious protest from a Slav historian. "If it is decided," wrote Palicki, "to reverse the natural policy of Austria, if this empire, composed of a medley of different nationalities, refuses to accord equal rights to all, and organizes the supremacy of certain races over the others, if the Slavs are to be treated as an inferior people and handed over to two dominant peoples as mere material to be governed by them, then nature will assert herself and resume her rights. An inflexible resistance will transform hope into despair, and a peaceful into a warlike spirit, and there will be a series of conflicts and struggles of which it will be impossible to foresee the end. We Slavs existed before Austria, and we shall continue to exist after Austria has disappeared." Unquote. That is hardly doubtful. Imprison a Slav idea, it has been written, in the deepest dungeon of a fortress, and it will blow up the fortress in order to get out. But that peril belonged to the future. For the moment, Austria was once more saved, and the emperor's coronation in the cathedral in 1867 was a magnificent ceremony, every detail of it fraught with significance to those who knew their history. We have to picture Francis Joseph mounted on a snow-white horse, ascending the ancient hill and brandishing his sword to the 4 points of heaven as a sign that he would confound his subjects' enemies, whether they came from north, south, east, or west. A very different experience, truly from that of the days when Milan had received him and the Empress, with their heads covered in stony silence, and the people of Venice had shunned the Archduke Maximilian and the Archduchess Charlotte as if they were lepers who had escaped from quarantine. A part of the ceremony consisted in the presentation to him of a purse of money, and he ordered its contents to be distributed among the families of those who had fallen fighting against him in 1849. It was one of those magnificent gestures which, like kind words, are worth much and cost little. So that Francis Joseph, having turned a rebuff to his advantage, was stronger after Sadowa than before it, and he soon showed his skill in conciliating individuals by bestowing the office of Prime Minister upon the Count Andrassy, who had been condemned to death and hanged in effigy for his share in the Hungarian rebellion. "I am so glad I didn't really hang you," he said genially, "for, in that case, I should have deprived myself of the most capable and amiable of my prime ministers." And he did as good a day's work when he said that as when he promoted the old soldiers whom he had caught poaching to be gamekeepers. Moreover, he displayed a similar readiness to let bygones be bygones and to fight shoulder to shoulder with his old enemies when Prussia fell out with France in 1870. That, however, is an intricate story and demands a separate chapter.
This concludes today's reading of the life of the Emperor Francis Joseph, by Francis Gribble. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.